On the morning of June 4th, 1942, the Pacific Ocean boiled with tension. The sea looked deceptively calm, just blue horizon and scattered clouds. But beneath those clouds, two massive fleets were about to collide in what would become the Battle of Midway, a clash that would decide the direction of the Second World War in the Pacific. Hundreds of miles away, in a dimly lit naval communications room, a woman sat alone at her desk. She was one of the many code breakers, civilian experts, linguists, and naval intelligence staff who worked around the clock, feeding typewriters with endless reels of ribbon and paper, typing streams of intercepted Japanese messages. Her name is often forgotten, lost among files, stamped top secret. But her story, or rather her typewriter's story, has survived, because one afternoon, as she worked through a pile of coded messages from the Japanese combined fleet, her typewriter ribbon tore. It was a minor inconvenience, a smudge of ink on her fingers, a minute or two of delay. But that small delay, that torn strip of cloth, triggered a sequence of events that saved over 3,000 American lives and led to the destruction of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in just 5 hours. How could such a trivial moment change the course of history? To understand, we must go back not to the front lines of war, but to the quiet world of cryptanalysis, where minds were sharper than bullets, and where a single missed keystroke could decide a nation's fate. It was late May 1942, and the war in the Pacific hung in delicate balance. Just 6 months earlier, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor had left the U.S. Pacific Fleet crippled. The Japanese Navy dominated the seas, sweeping across Asia and the Pacific like a tidal wave. But hidden deep inside the U.S. Navy's intelligence network was a group of people fighting a different kind of battle. One fought not with torpedoes, but with paper, ink, and typewriter keys. Inside Station HYPO, the Navy's cryptanalytic center in Pearl Harbor, a handful of officers, mathematicians, and typists labored day and night to crack Japan's most important naval code, JN-25, a complex cipher used for Japanese fleet communications. Among them were several women, secretaries, linguists, and communications specialists. They weren't supposed to be heroes, they were supposed to type, but typing was everything. Every intercepted message, every decoded word, had to be transcribed perfectly into a report sent to fleet commanders. A single typo could change the meaning of a coded word or delay an entire operation. That's when it happened. A woman, her name remains uncertain, though many records point to one of the Waves women accepted for volunteer emergency service, attached to naval intelligence, was retyping an intercepted Japanese message when her typewriter ribbon suddenly tore. The ribbon jammed, the ink stopped printing letters, and for just a moment she had to stop, pull it free, and replace it. It was a pause that should have meant nothing. But as she fixed the ribbon, she noticed something odd on the carbon sheet. She'd been using a pattern in the code groups that looked slightly off from previous intercepts. She flagged it, set it aside, and logged it for her supervisor. That simple decision to question an anomaly rather than ignore it was passed up to a man named Commander Joseph Rochefort, head of Station Hypo. Rochefort was already deep into the Japanese cipher puzzle. His small team was inching closer to understanding where Japan's next strike would fall. They suspected the enemy was planning something big, an operation against a target codenamed AF. But until that moment, they didn't know what AF meant, and that torn ribbon and the delay it caused gave them the clue they needed. Because the intercepted message the woman was typing, the one interrupted by the tear, was part of a transmission referencing AF's water shortage. That phrase would soon become the smoking gun. When that message crossed Commander Rochefort's desk, it didn't look like much, just another coded transmission full of meaningless 5-digit groups. But Rochefort had trained his mind to see shadows in static. His team at Station Hypo had been struggling to determine what the Japanese meant by AF. The Imperial Navy used 2-letter designations for specific locations, but AF was still unsolved. Some officers in Washington believed it referred to the U.S. base at Johnston Atoll. Others thought it meant Fiji, or even the Aleutians. Rochefort's gut said otherwise. He suspected AF was Midway Atoll, a tiny island halfway between Hawaii and Japan, but he needed proof. That's where the torn ribbon came in. The woman's note about the anomaly in the intercept pointed to an incomplete phrase, something referencing AF's water supply. Rochefort realized it might be the key to confirming his theory, so he devised a plan. He instructed Midway's communications center to send a false radio message, an uncoded open transmission stating that the island's desalination plant had broken down and that Midway was short on fresh water. Within hours, Japanese intelligence intercepted the bait. Soon after, a Japanese encrypted message was decoded at Hypo. It reported that AF is short of water. That was it, the confirmation Rochefort needed. AF was indeed Midway. Now the US Navy knew exactly where Japan would strike. The information raced up the chain of command from Hypo in Pearl Harbor to Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. The revelation changed everything. Nimitz immediately began repositioning his carriers, Enterprise Hornet and the hastily repaired Yorktown, to set a trap for the oncoming Placicople. Japanese fleet. The woman who had noticed the torn ribbon and flagged that strange code group had no idea what her small observation had set in motion. But her moment of attention had triggered one of the most decisive acts of deception and intelligence in the entire war. While Japan believed it, it was about to ambush the remnants of the US Pacific Fleet. It was walking straight into an ambush of its own. And in that shadow war of signals and silence, a broken ribbon and a few stray letters had just rewritten history. By late May 1942, the Japanese Navy was confident of victory. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the same man who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, believed that the United States was still reeling. His new plan, Operation MI, would finish the job. 4 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers, Akagi Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would sail toward Midway Atoll. They would lure the remaining American carriers into battle and annihilate them. On paper, it was flawless. Japan's fleet outnumbered. The Americans, its pilots were seasoned from 6 months of victory, and its aircraft carriers formed the most lethal strike group on the planet. But what Yamamoto didn't know was that every key movement of his fleet was already being read in real time by US intelligence, thanks to that intercepted message, the one that confirmed AF was. Midway Admiral Nimitz knew exactly where and when the Japanese would appear. The broken typewriter ribbon that had briefly delayed a report had bought Hypo the few crucial minutes needed to catch that key intercept, decode it correctly, and send confirmation before the Japanese changed their cipher again. Timing in intelligence work is everything. Miss a message by an hour, and the clue is gone forever. Nimitz now had what every admiral dreams of, foreknowledge of the enemy's plan. He ordered his carriers to set sail and take position northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the Japanese scouting range. The US forces would let the Japanese strike first, then hit them when their decks were crowded with refueling planes. By the evening of June 3rd, Nimitz's carriers were in position. The trap was set. Back in the intelligence rooms, the woman who had noticed the oddity in the coded message typed more intercepts as they came in. She had no idea that her attention to detail had allowed Nimitz to place 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, directly in the path of Japan's most powerful naval strike force. The battle that would follow would last only 5 hours, but in those 5 hours, the fate of the Pacific would be decided. The dawn of June 4, 1942, broke with grim resolve. Japanese bombers from their 4 carriers launched waves of attacks on Midway Island itself, hoping to neutralize the US base. But hidden beyond the horizon, American carrier planes were already airborne, vectored by intelligence that had come from Station Hypo's cracked codes. The American dive bombers and torpedo planes struck with precision and ferocity. First, Enterprise and Hornet launched their planes against the Akagi and Kaga, crippling the carriers with devastating hits to their flight decks and fuel stores. Meanwhile, Yorktown, despite being damaged only days earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea, launched a daring attack on Soryu and later on Hiryu. The Japanese pilots were caught off guard, scrambling to repel the strikes but overwhelmed. In just 5 brutal hours, all 4 Japanese carriers, the heart of their naval air power, were set ablaze, sinking beneath the Waves' American losses were severe but limited compared to what might have been. More than 3,000 American sailors and aviators owed their lives to the fact that the US fleet was waiting prepared and forewarned, rather than surprised. The torn typewriter ribbon, the woman's pause, the decoded message, they all fed into a chain reaction that turned the tide of one of history's most important naval battles. The Japanese Navy's hopes of domination were shattered, and the Pacific War had shifted irreversibly. While bombs and fire raged hundreds of miles away, the real hero of this story was tucked away in a quiet, fluorescent-lit room filled with the clatter of typewriters and the hum of radio receivers. She was one of many women in the Waves, the Navy's volunteer service assigned to cryptologic and communications work during the war. Unlike the headline-grabbing fighter pilots or admirals, these women operated in shadows, their faces unknown, their names unrecorded in most histories. This woman's name is lost to time, but her contribution is crystal clear. A moment's focus when the typewriter ribbon tore, a brief pause that forced her to double-check a strange pattern in a coded message. Her diligence didn't just fix a ribbon. It unlocked a secret that the Japanese Navy thought was safely hidden behind layers of encryption. She was trained to transcribe quickly, to keep the wheels of intelligence turning without error. But that day she became the human element that broke the chain of secrecy. In the months and years following the Battle of Midway, the role of women in cryptanalysis and signals intelligence became clearer. Without them, the complex machinery of wartime code-breaking could not have functioned. This woman's torn ribbon is a symbol of the countless small, unseen acts of courage and precision that sustained the Allied war effort. It was a reminder that sometimes history turns on the smallest details, a pause, a torn ribbon, a question asked in time. The destruction of 4 Japanese carriers at Midway was more than a tactical victory. It was a strategic earthquake that reshaped the Pacific War's entire landscape. Japan's naval air power, forged in years of training and hardened by battle, was suddenly crippled. The loss of those carriers and their experienced air crews created a gap the Imperial Navy could never fully recover from. For the United States, the victory provided not just a morale boost, but a vital breathing space to rebuild and expand its fleet. The 3,000 lives saved were not just numbers. They were pilots who would go on to fight in battles at Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf, and beyond. The ripple effect extended far beyond the battlefield. The confidence gained by the US Navy after Midway enabled more aggressive offensives across the Pacific, shifting the war from defensive survival to relentless counterattack. And it all traced back to a torn typewriter ribbon in a small, dim office where a woman's sharp eye and steady hands turned intercepted signals into life-saving intelligence. The code-breaking victories at Midway were only the beginning. Throughout the war, American cryptologists and their colleagues would continue to crack enemy ciphers, providing a crucial edge in battles from the Atlantic to the Philippines. History often remembers the thunder of guns and the flash of explosions, but sometimes the quiet moments, a torn ribbon, a typed line, a paused breath, write the most important chapters. The Battle of Midway stands as one of the greatest naval victories in history, a fierce clash of steel fire and willpower that reshaped the fate of nations. But beneath the roaring engines and exploding bombs was a quieter battle fought in shadows and whispers, a battle where human focus, patience, and a moment's hesitation saved thousands of lives. That torn typewriter ribbon, seemingly trivial, was a thread pulling together intelligence, courage, and chance. It reminds us that history is never made by grand gestures alone, but by the small acts of countless individuals whose stories often go untold. In the end, war is not just decided on the battlefield, but in the unseen rooms, where secrets are uncovered, where one woman's sharp eye paused long enough to change everything. When the seas finally stilled and the smoke cleared, it wasn't just the sinking of 4 Japanese carriers that mattered, it was the survival of thousands the hope ignited, and a turning point that echoed through the rest of the war. A torn ribbon, a quiet desk, and one woman's moment, a reminder that sometimes the smallest things can save the world.